What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up another top 10 decks of the week. It's a weekly episode that we do every single week, so be sure to tune in next week as well. And before we get into the list, please check out the last video I just posted about future cards that we need in Pokemon Pocket. It's a really cool and interesting video. I basically looked at a bunch of cards from the paper TCG and looked at them and broke them down and decided which ones I would like to see come into Pocket. Really cool video. Go check it out. And before we get into this, please leave a comment in the comment section below at the end of the video. Like, subscribe, and share. Hit that notification button as I do post videos every single day, and join my Discord and my Twitter to find out where my schedule is for live streams on Twitch and YouTube. But this top 10 list is calculated by going to Play Limitless TCG. You can even do it yourself, but I will explain how I do it. Just so there were some people in the comments last week wondering why certain decks were not on the list. This is how I decide my top 10s. Basically, I go to Play Limitless TCG. I click on decks. I look at all decks with a 50% or more a win rate. I then begin a process of elimination, removing basically any decks that have a less than 2% play rate. I completely remove them out to kind of because it kind of just dilutes the list, and it makes it like you need to be able to look at decks to decide which ones are the best by ones that have been played the most. And then what I do is I look at tournaments over the past week with 256 or more people who played in a tournament. I look at which decks won tournaments, how many tournaments those decks won, and then I look at how many tops each top deck that I'm looking at made it into top cuts. And then what I do is basically I reserve the top portion of the list, the top 3 or 4 decks for the decks that actually won tournaments. And then basically the win rates are all very similar, and so I base it off who has the most tops. And then I reserve the last spot, the number 10 deck on the list, for a deck like this, basically a spicy deck that somebody had brought to a tournament and did very well. In fact, this deck right here actually topped in multiple tournaments this past week with 256 or more people. So this is really the reason why it made this top 10 list. It's a Magnezone Jolteon deck. It has a below 1% play rate, like a 0.04, but it did top 2 or 3 tournaments this week with 256 or more people. Has a 51% win rate overall in the game right now, and it's a pretty cool and interesting deck. Yes, it is a Magnezone deck, but the cool thing about this is it pairs it with Jolteon and Zapdos. So basically the way I think that this deck works is basically you're starting your game off with either a Jolteon or a Zapdos, trying to get it completely loaded up, and then trying to steal prize with super duper lucky coin flips. And then even if you don't get those very lucky heads for your Jolteon or your Zapdos to get huge knockouts on Pokemon EX Pokemon, you have a Magnezone that's building up in the back by itself anyways, and so you really have that Magnezone to fall back on if that original plan fails. And then you also have like an end game bringing out another Jolteon or a Zapdos in the end game to get those lucky coin flips and just completely steal the game. Cool thing about this deck as well, it only plays one EX Pokemon, so like for all intents and purposes, it's really a single price deck. I'm sure you're not going to want to play the Zapdos unless you really have no choice, and then bring it in into the end, so your opponent would have had to actually remove 3 Pokemon from your board to get 3 prizes. This deck is also playing a bunch of one-ofs. Obviously, Cyrus is a standard, and obviously Pokeball Research, I won't talk about them, but 1 Rocky Helmet. I'm actually surprised that this isn't a cape. It's playing 1 Communications, which I actually agree with, and this is a funny thing to say, but I actually agree that 1 Communication is better in a deck with a lot more Pokemon, whereas 2 is actually better in a deck with less Pokemon. I know that might not make sense when you hear it at first, but because you're less likely to actually hit the Pokemon you want in a deck with more Pokemon, you're really only relying on your Communications when you know you can hit it, whereas when you have less Pokemon, you want the the chance to be higher that you draw into that communication in order to play it and guarantee, because you already know you're going to get the Pokemon you want because you're playing such a minimal amount of Pokemon. And then obviously Dawn works super well in this deck. It works really well in almost any Magnezone deck, to be completely honest, but in this deck even more because you're actually playing Lightning Pokemon. So because you're ramping with Magneton, you can just use Dawn to put one of those energies that you ramped onto a Jolteon or a Zapdos. So super duper cool. And then of course Mars, if you are playing the Zapdos EX at the beginning of the game, it gets knocked out. You can really bring your opponent's hand size down to 1 once that happens, so it's a very strong end game card. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 9. So this is deck number 9, and it's the Rampardos deck. Specifically, this one on the screen is the Rampardos Lucario deck. What I actually did for the number 9 spot is I actually combined the stats of 2 different Rampardos decks. The one that plays with Lucario and the one that plays without it. Both of those decks are kind of like, have like pretty much the exact same stats. They have the same win rate. It's about a 52 to 53% win rate. And I actually... Obviously, this version is a lot stronger because of Lucario. However, the one without Lucario is playing things like Marshadow and Hitmonlee, and I actually love that version a lot more. I don't always think Rampardos needs that extra attack. Obviously, you're going to be able to one-shot a lot more Pokemon when you have a Lucario on, but the cool thing about Rampardos is that you don't need to one-shot everything. You can actually hit it for 130, not knock it out, and then force a retreat or get knocked out, but who cares, because you're only giving up one prize card, and then you can just Cyrus out whatever they may have retreated anyways. Or what you can do is, because in the non-Lucario version you're playing Hitmonlee, even if they retreat, you most likely got them down to that 30 HP point, break point, so you can just knock it out with a Hitmonlee anyways. In those cases, you're probably going to want to hold a Hitmonlee in your hand and then put it down the turn you actually want to put it into the active, to not let your opponent know that that's what you have. So I actually think this deck is really good. I think both versions have legs to stand on. I prefer the non-Lucario version. I do prefer Lucario in non-Rampardos decks, but that's just me. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 8. Number 8 deck on the list is the Palkia EX Vaporeon deck. This deck is still very good. It doesn't have as high of a win rate as pretty much every other deck on this list, but it did make number 8 because it did get 6 tops this past week in tournaments with 256 or more people. It does have a very high meta share with 4% and has a 51% win rate. This deck is still super strong. I'm surprised it's actually not as good as some other decks, but honestly, I think there's just the way the meta works right now is you're having Darkrai decks that are also just doing very, very good. It's a very good card. And then you have Magnezone decks that are doing super well too, because Magnezone is a very good card, probably the best card in the game right now because of Magneton. And then you have Celebi Executor that is just doing way better than everything because there's so much dark Pokemon in the meta scene right now. And not just that, even in those matchups where you're not super strong against dark Pokemon, Executor and Celebi can just put a ton of power out, both of them. A single a single energy requirement Executor can do a ton of beginning damage at the beginning of the game, and then Celebi can just sweep games once it's loaded up. So this deck isn't doing as good as some other decks, but I still think it's one of the best decks in the game. The fact that you can ramp with Manaphy, basically load up your entire board, and also ramp with Misty, and then move all those energies around with Vaporeon. There's so much energy manipulation you can do in this deck. It's super duper good. And then this deck also, there's versions that don't play Articuno EX and ones that do. The ones that do, the reason for this, I believe, is because they're kind of trying to make sure that they're playing 7 basics, because if you think of it like a Pikachu EX deck, where you want to almost guarantee that Pikachu has 3 Pokemon on the bench so it can attack and do full damage. It's the same thing or the same idea in this case, where you want to guarantee you get at least 2 Pokemon on the bench to start ramping onto with Manaphy. So this is why you often see 7 basics in a deck like this. It's because of Manaphy, and the same reason why Pikachu wants multiple Pokemon on the bench. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 7. So this is deck number 7. It's the Yanmega Dialga deck, and there's two Yanmega decks out there right now. It's Yanmega Dialga and Yanmega Executor EX. I always thought that the Yanmega Executor EX deck was better because there is a lot of dark in the meta, and you really want to be able to counter one of the top meta share types in the game right now, which is obviously dark. But this one actually outplayed Executor EX version of it this past week. This deck has about a 2% meta share, a 52% win rate, and got 6 tops, which was a lot more than the Executor version, which I'm actually kind of okay with. This version of the deck also gets to play Mew and also gets to attack with Dialga as well. So you have a lot more options in this deck. And you also get to potentially hit for weakness for 3 different types. There aren't, I think, very many, if any at all, that are weak to steel type from Dialga, and the majority, but there are a lot of Pokemon that are weak to Mew EX, but he's probably going to knock out those Pokemon by copying their attacks anyways at most points. But anyways, this deck is really good. It did a lot better than the Executor version, and again, I'm super duper okay with that because Executor EX has like 3 or 4 different decks running around right now, so it's okay that one of them didn't make the list. But anyways, this deck was number 7. Let's get into deck number 6. So this is deck number 6. It's the Pachirisu 18 Trainer. I actually just did a video on Pachirisu Pikachu EX, and the deck was really good. However, that deck overall on Play Limitless TCG right now is only about a 48% win rate, whereas this deck is actually a 53% win rate. Only has about a 2% meta share, but topped 7 times in tournaments with 256 people in the past week. This deck, it was on the list last week, and it's on the list again this week. It's just because 53% is a very good win rate, and 7 tops is super duper good for a deck that's an 18 trainer deck. But again, these types of decks are going to continue to get stronger the more trainers that come out, making these decks better. This deck obviously can play 4 Gust cards, 2 Sabrina, 2 Cyrus, which is the play right now in these decks. It could play Red card for early game control and Mars for late game control. It's playing 4, if not 5 sometimes, tool cards to make sure that Pachirisu actually gets it. It is playing a blue again, which I totally agree with. I said last week I would have liked to seen 2 blue, but we are still on the 1 blue. I think we could remove 1 Mars and put a second blue, 100% in my opinion. But it's just my opinion. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 5. So this is deck number 5, and you all know it. It's the Weavile Darkrai EX deck. This deck was one of the best decks when it first came out, and then everyone started figuring out other Darkrai decks. This deck is still super duper good. A 3% meta share, 51% win rate, and 9 tops over the past week with 256 people in tournaments. Or in tournaments with 256 people, sorry. But this deck is super good, and it used to play, and I'm sure some versions still play Spiritomb and or Farfetch'd in the decks. The more often, or the more decks I look at, the more often or not aren't playing the Spiritomb or Farfetch'd anymore, so possibly that this is the best version of the deck, is just not playing them. I do think Spiritomb just fits so well in this deck. The fact that you can basically hit all Pokemon on your opponent's side, potentially 4 Pokemon for 10 damage, basically making them all online for Cyrus, so you can bring them out and then start aggressively attacking them with Weavile. But at the end of the day, like, let's be honest, because we're playing 2 Sabrina, you could basically get, not basically, but you can often maybe get a card you want out into the front anyways, hit it with Darkrai, and then potentially Dawn the following turn, or just load up a Weavile and not worry about it. So you could get damage on the Pokemon you want to really knockout anyways. You're also playing Rocky Helmets to make up for some of those things as well. Basically, you're always going to be able to put damage on something, so your Weavile will most likely always be set up anyway. So maybe the Spiritomb is not needed in this deck anymore. But with that being said, let's get into deck number 4. So this is deck number 4. It's the Greninja Darkrai Druddigon deck, or it could even be called the Kangaskhan deck in there now. It's really just Greninja Darkrai, or some people call it Dark Ninja. The idea of this deck is basically you get a ton of free damage. You're able to get free damage by putting energies on your Darkrai. You get tons of free damage by people attacking into your Druddigon, and then you get a ton of free damage from your Greninja because of its Water Shuriken ability. So you can basically control and possibly knock out multiple Pokemon in one turn by putting those damage counters on the Pokemon you want and then attacking into the Pokemon you want as well. This deck is super good. It is a 5% meta share, 54% win rate, and it got 15 tops in tournaments this week with 256 or more people. This deck and most Darkrai decks right now that are playing very strong tanky lead Pokemon like Druddigon and Kangaskhan are starting to split it. They are starting to do either Druddigon, so usually it was always Druddigon, and then it was Druddigon Kangaskhan. Last week we saw a bunch of decks that were just playing Kangaskhan. This version that did very well this week is playing both, and I do like the versatility of it. I do like the Kangaskhan version a little bit better because then you can just play Rocky Helmets and or just get more damage with your Kangaskhan than your Druddigon would have been able to get. Anyways, so this deck's still doing very well, but let's get into deck number 3. So this is deck number 3, and of course another Magnezone deck. Magnezone and Darkrai have so many different decks because they're just such good cards. There are 3 Darkrai decks on this list, and there are 3 Magnezone decks on this list. This is the second Magnezone that we are getting to look at, and it's the new big bad Magnezone deck that's on the scene. It kind of came up last week, maybe a little bit the week before as well, but it's the Skarmory version. This basically made the Hitmonlee version of the deck completely irrelevant. This deck is obviously just doing a lot better. It has a 4% meta share at this point. It has a 54% win rate, just like the Greninja Darkrai deck, and got, listen to this, 2 tournament wins this week, but more importantly, I think, 59 tops. It topped 59 times this week in just the last 7 days in tournaments with 256 or more people. That is insane. In fact, the next 2 decks actually have more tops than that. And so these 3 decks, the top 3, are by far the best 3 decks in the game right now. And one of them is this deck. You're able to just get so much early game damage with your Skarmory. You're playing 4 tool cards, so basically you're always going to have an item card on your Skarmory. Do a ton of early game damage and then build up your Magnezone in the back, or slowly build your Heatran up in the back to be able to do 110 damage, just like your Magnezone would be able to do anyways. So this deck is really good. You're also playing Giovanni's and on top of your Rocky Helmets, so you're able to really get a ton of breakpoints. The Skarmory being able to do 60 damage, 50 because it has a tool card, and then 60 with the Giovanni is super duper important. There's so many Pokemon that evolve into other Pokemon that have 60 HP. To be able to get that early game prize is super duper good in this deck, and it is a single prize deck and is one of the top 3 decks in the game. When there's a single prize deck that is a top 3 deck in the game, that is saying a lot. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 2. So this is deck number 2, and of course it's the Dark Zone deck, the Darkrai Magnezone deck. That is, of course, like I just said, playing 2 Kangaskhan. Again, they were usually playing Druddigons. People started switching into 1 Druddigon, 1 Kangaskhan, and now the versions that are doing the best seem to be playing Kangaskhan, and I totally agree. Like I said, you could basically do more damage with your Kangaskhan, doing 30 damage a turn, potentially 60 damage. Yes, you can do 0, but the turns you do 0, you can have a Rocky Helmet on it anyway, so it's basically a Druddigon that could attack for 1 energy, doing up to 60, potentially 30 damage a turn anyway. So I do think the Kangaskhan is the better play. Of course, I do like the versatility, but I do think that Kangaskhan right now is the better card. This deck is also playing 2 Gust cards. I love the split. 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cape, 1 Rocky Helmet. So a lot of different options. Again, 1 Pokemon Communications I think is perfect in decks that play quite a bit of Pokemon. Of course, 1 Leaf. You don't need to abuse Leafs or X speeds in this game. I think you're going to get enough energy out to be able to get some free retreats on a Magnemite and then make up for it on on a Magneton early on, and then you only really need to get the Kangaskhan out if you need to. You can sometimes let him go and then just bring in the Darkrai and save the leaf for a Darkrai later in the game. So this deck is super strong, but for the stats, 9% meta share, the second most played deck in the game right now. 55% win rate is the highest win rate on this deck list out of all 10 decks that we're going to look at, but is not the number one deck, but got 4 wins this week and had 85 tops. 85 tops in tournaments this week with 256 or more people, but there was only like 7 or 8 tournaments that had 256 or more people, so getting 85 tops is absolutely humongous. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into the number one deck. So this is the number one deck. It was the number one deck last week, is the number one deck this week, and it will probably be the number one deck next week or until the new mini set drops, which I think is coming pretty soon within the next couple of days. Within the next week at least, I'm pretty sure. But this deck is super duper good. First of all, Executor EX, 160 HP, 1 energy requirement, possibly doing anywhere between 40 or 80 damage. If you get those 80 damage flips, you are going to get a ton of early game damage or prizes just from your Executor. It's already so bulky with 160 HP. If you throw that giant cape on there, 180 HP on a stage 2, that could do a ton of damage, is super destructive. And then you can slowly build up your Celebi EX in the back. Again, the superior decks are terrible right now. You do not need superior in this metagame to get a ton of energy on your Celebi, and you don't even need that many. Sometimes you only need 4. If you get it up to 6, obviously that's super good. If you could get it even higher, even better. This deck will stay online for long enough to get that Celebi up, because again, if you have 180 HP Executor and you're not up against something like Charizard, you can potion and Erica all your damage back almost every single turn. Or you can even if it doesn't have 180, 160 still enough, and then you can put Rocky Helmets on it, get in all that extra damage. If you do 80 damage on a let's say something like a Kangaskhan, or even a Druddigon. Let's say Kangaskhan, for example, you do 80 damage. It can't even attack you back unless it heals itself a bit, because it's going to get knocked out if there's a Rocky Helmet on there. So this deck is so strong. There's also so much dark in the meta right now. Like I said, there's Darkrai Magnezone, Darkrai Greninja, Darkrai Weavile, so there is a lot. And like I said, they all have huge meta shares. If you add them all up, I'll do it right now, 9%, 5%, 3%. So almost if you add up all the Darkrai decks and all the dark decks that are just on this list, it's actually a higher meta share than Executor EX. So the chances of you actually seeing a dark Pokemon that's weak to grass is very, very likely. This deck could also tank so many shots from other decks anyways, and then output so much damage with the Celebi and or Executor that you don't really have too many bad matchups. And the fire decks that are really strong right now are pretty much only Charizard, and it doesn't even have a 50% win rate. And even though it's strong because it does 200 damage. So even if it wasn't a fire type that hits for grass for weakness, it would knock it out anyways. So this deck is just super duper strong right now. I cannot wait for the new mini set. At first I was like, the new mini set's coming out way too fast, but at the same time, I think we've all got a great idea of where the meta is now. I think we're all kind of sick and tired of seeing there's in the top decks right now that aren't even on this list. Executor has top 3 decks, right? It has the Omega build, it has the Executor EX Mew EX build, it has this build, so that's 3 decks for Executor EX. You have Magnezone that has like 15 decks, let's be honest at this point, but just on this list alone had 3. It also would probably have 4 if Hitmonlee was still doing very good. The Hitmonlee version. There's a Greninja version that's doing super good. There's a Magnezone Mew EX deck that's doing really well right now. It has a bunch of different versions of that deck, but that's doing super duper good. It just didn't make the list. And then Darkrai has 3 decks, again, just on this list alone. And we're only looking at 10 decks this week, which we do every week, but every week we only look at 10 decks, and it always has multiple Executor EX, multiple Magnezone decks, and multiple Darkrai deck, so I am kind of getting a little tired of the same meta over and over again, and people just throwing Magnezone into everything, but I cannot wait for the new mini set to drop. But anyways, with that being said, thanks so much for tuning in, and as always, keep cooking.